So my paper is, does having deep personal relationships constitute an element of well-being? And as Bill said, I'm going to skip the bits that are crossed out in red and maybe speak louder when I read the bits that are underlined in red. I'm using the term well-being as a synonym for welfare, flourishing, and personal good. Beyond question, having deep personal relationships can bring people pleasure, emotional support, knowledge, a sense of achievement, and many other benefits. However, such relationships can also be causes of disappointment, frustration, danger, and more generally, personal disaster. This paper is not about the benefits or harms to which deep personal relationships can be instrumental. The paper is about whether having deep personal relationships constitute elements of well-being. By asking whether deep personal relationships is an element of well-being, I'm not asking whether someone can have a life that's positive in terms of well-being without deep personal relationships. I accept that a life that misses out on deep personal relationships might have enough other good elements in it to come out net positive in terms of well-being for the person who has that life. The question I'm addressing is whether having deep personal relationships is constitutively beneficial to the parties to the relationship, even if having a deep personal relationship is not a necessary condition of having a decently good life. So first, what are the elements of deep personal relationships? Some personal relationships are very shallow. I'm not concerned with shallow personal relationships, nor am I concerned with relationships you might call intermediate between shallow and deep. My focus is exclusively on deep personal relationships. Now, what are the essential features of deep personal relationships? One essential feature of deep personal relationships is a multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character. I'm going to comment below on the vagueness of that proposition, but let me acknowledge immediately that this multifaceted understanding need not be complete and need not be articulated. Now, two people's multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character is very typically, I guess probably almost always, gained through a shared history of activities together. At the limit, such shared activities might be merely conversations between the parties. But of course, a more secure evidential base for beliefs about someone's personality and character would include very many observations of that person's behavior, since these observations might bear on the truth of what the person has asserted in the conversations you've been having with the person. Indeed, precisely because people can learn so much about one another from observing behavior, a shared history of activities that generates a multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character might involve vanishingly little conversation, and none of it about especially meaningful topics. People can get to know one another well enough for a deep personal relationship without ever discussing with one another their parents, life goals, the meaning of life, etc. Developing a deep and multifaceted understanding of something as complex as a person's personality and character takes time. Such an understanding will need to range over the person's thinking and behavior in a variety of different contexts and in the face of different kinds of challenges. Moreover, personality and character change over time, and at least some of a person's personality and character changes need to be understood in order for an understanding of her to be deep enough for a deep personal relationship with her. Only in fantasy can a deep and multifaceted understanding of something as complex as the personality and character of a person be achieved in a moment. Such points seem to me to be reflected in the stress that some, I should say many, writers put on a shared history. But must a multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character be the product of a shared history of joint activities? Most definitely that route is the normal one. But with a little imagination, I think we can describe a case where two people develop a multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character without having shared history of joint activities. Imagine that Sarah and Anne read many books and reports about one another. Imagine that their reading up on one another is not a joint activity, even if it happens to be simultaneous. Suppose that from the reports and books, they learn a lot of the most important facts about each other's personality and character. Reading all this material, making sense of it, and embedding it in memory takes time. But by the end of this time, I think Sarah and Anne might have a degree of understanding with one another that meets what we might call the knowledge threshold for having a deep personal relationship. And yet they did not acquire this understanding through a shared history of joint activities. Except that example might not persuade you. You might think that for two people to have a deep personal relationship with one another, they must have a multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character that comes from interaction with one another. Now, if interaction is absolutely necessary, then Sarah and Anne's having read a lot of books and reports about one another is just not good enough. I think it is good enough, but I recognize that others might disagree with me about that. Nevertheless, undeniably, in at least a very high percentage of cases in which two people acquire multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character, they in fact acquire it from a shared history of joint activities. Now, the second essential feature of deep personal relationships is that the parties involved must have a strong affection for one another. Admittedly, there's a kind of deep personal relationship between people who are longstanding enemies. And there can be instrumental benefits, as well as much more obviously instrumental costs, from having enemies. Whether or not two people's being enemies counts as they're having a deep personal relationship, the idea that being enemies with someone constitutes an element of well-being seems to me very, very implausible. Henceforth, in this paper, my discussion of deep personal relationships will be restricted to ones involving strong affection. The strong affection I have in mind necessarily involves strong concern for the other's welfare. Now, strong concern for the other's welfare has attitudinal, motivational, and dispositional components, which I'll say more about, but I'm going to skip. These motivations and behavioral dispositions will sometimes lose out in conflicts with other motivations and dispositions. In order to have strong affection for you, it's not necessary that I always do what I think is beneficial to you. And yet, if I never do what I think is beneficial to you, despite having opportunities, then whether I really do have strong affection for you is thrown into question. Whether strong affection necessarily involves partiality is controversial. Many writers have claimed that the concept of deep personal relationships is such that we don't have a deep personal relationship with one another unless we give one another priority over other people. But imagine two people stranded together on a remote island away from the rest of the world. Suppose that these two people come to know one another extremely well, and they care intensely about one another. Now, part of their concern for one another would presumably be instrumental, since both would have needs for companionship and help from the other. But let us imagine that each person's concern for the other is not wholly instrumental. To make this point especially clear, we can imagine that these two grow so fond of one another that each would be willing to sacrifice his own life to save the other person's life. Now, with deep knowledge about and intense concern for one another, these two people, seems to me, undeniably have a deep personal relationship. Now, let's add the extra stipulation that, as far as these two people are aware, there are no other human beings anywhere else. They think they're the only ones anywhere. Hence, they cannot be prioritizing one another over other people, since they are not aware that there are any other people. I think this example illustrates the possibility of two people having strong affection for one another without actually giving priority to one another over other people. And actually, I think we can think of examples that do not involve remote two-person islands, fantasies about remote two-person islands. Imagine a small tribe living far away from anywhere else and anyone else. Sorry, living far away from anyone else and unaware of the existence of anyone else. Again, imagine that, unaware of anyone else outside their group, these people have strong affection for one another without actually prioritizing one another over outsiders. The example of the two people on the remote island is imaginary, of course, though hardly novel. And the example of the remote tribe is not imaginary, but there are, I guess, now at most few tribes left who do not know that the world contains people outside the tribe. And indeed, nearly all of the world's current adult population are aware that the world contains a vast number of people. For people who know that the world contains a vast number of people, there's no realistic prospect that the strong concern had for friends can be mirrored by an equally strong concern for each of the vast number of others. I take it to be an empirical fact about human psychology that human beings are capable of sustaining strong affection for only a limited number of other individuals. Now, if that is an empirical fact, then whatever strong affection people have must be focused on only some others rather than spread across all of very many others. People's strong affection for some others will, at least in many contexts, lead them to prioritize the people for whom they have strong affection over anyone else for whom they don't have strong affection. And this is as it should be, since when you are deciding to whom to allocate your own time, attention, and other resources, you're always allowed and sometimes required to give some degree of priority to those with whom you have deep relationships. Now, I have already acknowledged that developing a deep and multifaceted understanding of something as complex as a person's personality and character takes time. Strong mutual affection, however, is sometimes ignited quickly. While developing a deep understanding for one another takes significant time and igniting affection does not, both the understanding and the affection have to persist for a significant duration in order for there to be a deep personal relationship. A personal relationship that lasted for only a brief episode was not a deep personal relationship. So now let me turn to theories of well-being. I'm going to be brief about two and much longer about the third. Here's the first. Hedonists think that how much a person's life benefits him or her is solely a matter of how much net pleasure she or he gets over the course of the life. Hedonists thus hold that having a deep personal relationship is not an element of well-being, but at best a means to obtaining net pleasure. If instead we believe that having a deep personal relationship is an element of well-being, we apparently are not hedonists. Now, in reply, hedonists might contend that the pleasures of friendship are distinct in kind, higher in quality, and irreplaceable by any other pleasure. Even if that's correct, the hedonist still attributes non-instrumental value to the pleasures of friendship rather than to the friendship itself. And we are now very familiar with thought experiments in which someone is given the illusion of having friends, and thus is giving what he believes are the experiences of having friends without really having friends. If hedonism concentrates on the properties of a subject's experiences as perceived from the subject's perspective at the time of the experiences, then the experiences produced by the illusion of a deep relationship could provide more pleasure than the experiences of actually having a deep relationship. Thus, an implication of any form of hedonism that concentrates on the properties of the subject's experiences as perceived from the subject's perspective at the time of the experiences is that having a deep personal relationship is not an element of well-being. Desire fulfillment theories of well-being maintain that what constitutes our well-being is the fulfillment of our desires. According to desire fulfillment theories, our having deep personal relationships benefits us if and only if our desires are fulfilled to a greater extent than they would be if our lives lacked such relationships, whether or not our net pleasure increases. Note the contrast with hedonism, which holds that our having deep personal relationships benefits us if and only if we get more pleasure as a result, whether or not we desire to have such relationships. Let me just ad lib here that I take it that a desire fulfillment theorist is going to say, well, if you have a desire for a deep personal relationship, then the deep personal relationship can constitute a benefit to you. And if you don't have a desire for a deep personal relationship, then it can't constitute a benefit to you, instrumental benefits being set aside for the moment. A different theory of well-being holds that how much a person's life benefits him or her depends on the extent to which that life contains multiple elements. Since this theory of well-being holds that there are multiple elements, the theory is sometimes called pluralism about well-being. Since the theory holds that what the elements of well-being are is not determined by subjective desire, the theory is often called the objective list theory, or at least it has been since Parfit 1984. different varieties of objective list theory pick out different elements. Nearly all varieties of objective list theory admit that how much a person's life benefits him or her or him, is partly a matter of how much net pleasure she or he gets. The main debate is not about whether net pleasure is on the objective list, but rather about what else is on the objective list. Perhaps the leading variety of objective list theory is one that follows Derek Parfit and Jim Griffin in taking the elements of well-being to be pleasure, important knowledge, significant achievement, autonomy, and deep personal relationships. Now, you might think, well, why even say that if you're not going to appeal to authority? I'm not going to appeal to authority. I'm going to present what I take to be the kind of argument that would persuade us that something is or isn't on the objective list theory. We run the following kind of thought experiment. We imagine two possible lives an agent might have on the assumption that these possible lives are as much alike as possible, except that one of these lives contains an item that the other doesn't. And then we think about whether the life containing that item would be more beneficial to the agent than the other life. If the correct answer is that the life containing that item would not be more beneficial to the agent than the other life, then that item is not on the list of elements of well-being. I take it as sort of isolation test argument. For illustration, imagine an agent whose life could have either of two possible futures. These alternative futures are as much alike as possible in terms of the amounts of net pleasure, important knowledge, significant achievement, and autonomy. However, in one of these possible futures, the agent's life contains deep personal relationships, and in the other, the agent's life doesn't contain deep personal relationships. If the two possible futures contain the same amounts of net pleasure, important knowledge, significant achievement, and autonomy, then the life with deep personal relationships seems more beneficial to the agent. And if the life with deep personal relationships seems more beneficial to the agent, what's the best explanation? Well, an explanation that suggests itself is that what seems to be so is so. That is, the life with deep personal relationships is more beneficial to the agent. And the natural explanation of why the life with deep personal relationships is more beneficial to the agent living that life is that having deep personal relationships is on the list of elements that constitute additions to well-being. Okay, so I was persuaded by that line of argument for 35 years, some ridiculously long period of time. And then I read a paper by my friend Roger Crisp and dogmatic slumber, and I knocked me out of my dogmatic slumber. And he posed a thought experiment that did this. And actually, I think he would admit this thought experiment's not original. Titania awakes. The first person she sees is bottom. The second person she sees is top. Because of the magic juice that Titania's husband Oberon has sprinkled in her eyes, she's developed a deep affection for bottom. Now, Titania's affection for bottom is a highly contingent psychological fact about her. Had she seen top first, she would have felt the same affection for him instead. I mean, you might remember the magic juice is such that whomever the person with the magic juice on his or her eyes first sees will be the object of this person's intense affection. Okay, that's how it's set up. So Chris poses this thought experiment in a discussion of whether there are moral reasons that come from partiality. And my focus is on whether having deep personal relationships is an element of well-being. So our papers are really about different things. Although the focus of Roger's discussion is different from mine, his arguments against the idea that there are moral reasons that come from partiality can be recast as an argument against the idea that having deep personal relationships is an element of well-being. This recast argument is that although affection is very often instrumentally valuable, the Titania case dramatizes that affection is too contingent and arbitrary to be valuable in itself. One person's affection for another is not enough to constitute a deep personal relationship. I mean, as I've suggested. However, Roger added, quote, "Nor does it matter if the affection in question is reciprocated. Imagine that Oberon had caused Bottom to feel for Titania what she feels for him. In other words, even if the affection is mutual, this mutual affection might be too contingent and arbitrary to be valuable in itself." Now, very many people hold that affection is utterly subjective in the sense that affection always depends completely upon the likes and impulses for which there are causal explanations, but not normative reasons. However, what if someone told us that he has strong affection for a saucer of mud? Suppose that when we ask about the aesthetic properties of the saucer of mud, he denies that there's anything beautiful about the color, the texture, or the shape of the mud, anything beautiful about the mud. And then we ask how this saucer of mud is connected to other things in the expectation that for him, the saucer of mud might have some kind of symbolic value. Suppose he asserts that this saucer of mud has no special connections to other things and thus no symbolic value. If he admits that the saucer of mud has no aesthetic or symbolic value, his statement that he has strong affection for the saucer of mud is just bewildering. Affection is not a fitting attitude to have towards a saucer of mud that has no aesthetic or symbolic value. I quote from Raz, "In general, an attachment must have a worthy object to be valuable." And what Raz says seems to me right. Obviously, affection is the kind of attachment relevant here. Affection is a fitting attitude to have towards a person only if either that person has qualities that warrant the affection or one has a duty of affection towards that person. The qualities that warrant the affection for a person are undefeated reasons for having affection for the person. Many people have qualities sufficiently endearing to merit affection, even though these people also have bad qualities. I won't try to say anything here about how much good is enough to outweigh the bad. Now, limited beings that we are capable of knowing about, much less having affection for, we are incapable of knowing about, much less having affection for, every single person with qualities warranting affection. The principle that ought implies can seems to apply here. If this principle does apply, then we should reject the idea that we ought to have affection for every single person who has qualities warranting affection. Reasons for having affection for a person that come from the person's good qualities must therefore be reasons that make affection sensible and permit it, but don't require it. I do not suppose that someone who has affection for someone must be able to articulate the qualities of the person that warrant the affection. Why a particular person warrants affection might be a long story involving lots of fine distinctions and weighing up of good qualities versus bad. And why a person warrants affection might involve facts about her of which other people can easily be unaware. The person herself might be unaware of many of these facts. Thus, people might have strong affection for someone that is warranted by the qualities of her that these people cannot specify and that she herself doesn't even know she has. Now, one of the most common causes of affection is beauty. However, does beauty make affection fitting? There seem to me at least 4 worries about the idea that beauty makes affection fitting. One is that beauty is a surface phenomenon. So consider an example of someone who has, on the one hand, captivating beauty, but on the other hand, this person is completely selfish, dominating, sadistic, dishonest. Admiring the beauty of this person may be one thing. Having affection for such a person would be another thing entirely, it seems to me. A second worry about the idea that beauty makes affection fitting is that beauty is something for which people are not responsible and so cannot deserve credit. Roger intimates that people should be given credit for their good qualities only if these qualities are, quote, the result of free and voluntary actions they've taken, unquote. Well, how people look is obviously not entirely a product of their choices, though the looks of people who are beyond a certain age partly depend on the choices they've made. I think we need not engage here in a discussion about whether people can be given at least a little credit for how they look. For we can justifiably like people for qualities they have, even if they cannot take credit for those qualities. Imagine someone born with a friendly disposition and then trained from a young age to be a virtuous and skilled, especially in activities that we find particularly interesting. These qualities of the other person make our affection for her fitting, even if she cannot take credit for these qualities. Equally, we can justifiably dislike people for bad qualities that were implanted in them, seems to me. A third worry about taking beauty to be a good justification for affection is that the beauty of things, at least living things, is normally transitory. If affection for someone is based on that person's beauty, Will affection fade as the beauty fades? Obviously, the worry about fading also applies to qualities other than beauty. For example, generosity of spirit, memory, analytical power, creativity, strength, and so on. Should affection based on these qualities fade as the qualities fade? The fourth worry is that very many people are beautiful. Likewise, very many people are extremely knowledgeable, very many tremendously kind, very many wonderfully witty, and so on. If we have affection for some people simply because of their good qualities, shouldn't we have affection for everyone else who possesses the same good qualities to the same degree or even more degree? Roger writes, quote, "I love my wife because she's beautiful, kind, and witty. But in that case, why should I be partial to my wife and not to all those who are beautiful, kind, and witty?" Now, Roger himself points to an answer to the problem about fading qualities and to the problem that there are too many objects with good qualities for us to be able to love them all. Earlier, we saw that deep personal relationships have as essential components not only mutual affection, but also multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character. Although gaining a multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character by means other than a shared history of joint activities might be possible, like my earlier example, the nearly universal means of gaining a multifaceted understanding of each other's personality and character is through a shared history of joint activities. And such a shared history expands with time, and time, so it grows as time grows. And time is the very thing that often corrodes good qualities such as beauty, energy, memory, quickness of mind, etc. As a shared history builds up between people, they might find that their understanding of and affection for one another grows. Furthermore, each might find endearing the other person's past achievements, abilities, generosity, even if the other person's abilities have faded and this person now has little left to give. Troy Jollimore wrote, "The lover, quote, will be especially inclined to see the image of the past in the face of the present," unquote. In many ways, therefore, the accumulation of a shared history might well correlate with the deepening of a relationship. Clearly, on the other hand, shared history does not on its own create a valuable relationship. The shared history might not have shown the two participants anything endearing about the other. Even more, the shared history can be one of making each other miserable. Indeed, extended contact with someone might reveal his terrible character. In that case, others would be right to back or even run away from him. So turn now to cases where a shared history leaves people opaque to one another. A shared history of mutual incomprehension does not lead to a deep personal relationship. Indeed, the role of a shared history in sustaining deep personal relationships is largely based on the presumption that this shared history will have given each party important knowledge about the other, including knowledge of endearing qualities. Thus, where the shared history does not yield knowledge of one another's endearing qualities, a deep relationship cannot be grounded in shared history. Now, consider cases where a shared history leads two people to have various false beliefs about one another's endearing qualities. Suppose Ivor's shared history with Natasha convinces Ivor that she consistently and strongly wants his life to go well for his sake, as opposed to just win and to the extent that her welfare somehow depends on what happens to him. Suppose the belief Ivor has about Natasha is false. The truth is that she cares about him only insofar as his welfare is instrumental to other concerns she has. Although she appeared to be his friend and he thought she was, in reality, she wasn't. Now, I'm not suggesting that false beliefs about someone, even false beliefs about someone that arise from a shared history with that person, always preclude having a deep personal relationship with that person. Suppose that a shared history between you and me has led you to think that I'm both self-aware and courageous. However, actually, I'm self-deluded and cowardly. If there is a considerable shared history between us on the basis of which we have many important true beliefs about one another and deep affection, we might have a deep relationship, even if one of us has important flaws of which the other is unaware, thank goodness. While in order to have a deep relationship with each other, we have to know a considerable number of important truths about one another, we don't have to know all important truths about one another. Now, return now to the example in which Ivor and Natasha's shared history leads Ivor to believe that Natasha stably and strongly wants his life to go well for his sake. But in fact, Ivor's belief about Natasha is false, since really her concern for him is only instrumental. In this example, Ivor and Natasha do not have a deep relationship. But what prevents them from having a deep relationship is not that he has false beliefs about her. It's rather that her concern for him is only instrumental. She doesn't have the kind of affection for him that is necessary for a deep relationship. As remarked earlier, the concept of a deep personal relationship, actually, I didn't remark that earlier, but I'm saying I'll admit it now. It has gray boundaries. There's a scale running from no personal relationship between this person and that person to very shallow personal relationship between this person and that person, to moderately substantial personal relationship between this person and that, to very deep personal relationship between this person and that. Of course, there are lots of points along the scale between the ones I've mentioned, and there's no sharp lines between the categories on the scale. We should therefore acknowledge the imprecision in the condition that a considerable degree of mutual affection and mutual knowledge is necessary for a deep personal relationship. However, this imprecise condition provides us with an escape from the point that there are an overwhelmingly large number of people who have good qualities and thus for whom affection would be fitting. Earlier, I contended that we are psychologically unable to have strong affection for every one of a vast number of individuals. But even if that were not true, we should consider the implications of the conjunction of the following two facts. First, the main route to a deep and multifaceted understanding of someone's personality and character is via a history of shared activities. And second, mortal beings that we are, we have a limited amount of time to get to know others deeply. Therefore, there are limits to the number of people we can get to know well enough in order for us to have deep personal relationships with them. Immortal beings might have enough time to form innumerable deep personal relationships. We mortal beings don't. Now, I turn to Roger's objection to taking shared history plus affection to be enough. Roger poses the following thought experiment. Suppose Titania, top and bottom, do have a shared history of joint activity. And suppose this shared history of joint activity has not caused them to have special affection for one another. However, then Oberon sprinkles his magic juice, and this juice on Titania's eyes, and this juice induces intense affection of Tanya for Bottom, and he sprinkles magic juice on Bottom's eyes, and so Bottom has intense affection for Titania. Given the shared history between Titania and Bottom, is the injection of intense affection in the imagined scenario enough to give them a deep personal relationship? Roger's example, let us interpret Roger's example as stipulating that the shared histories between Titania and Bottom and Titania and Top have given each a deep and multifaceted understanding of the other. But these deep and multifaceted understandings have not sparked deep affection. Then Oberon administers his magic juice, which causes strong affection between Titania and Bottom, or Titania and Top. If the magic juice wears off too quickly and the affection fades with it, then I think no deep personal relationship between the two is created. For as I wrote earlier, a significant period of mutual understanding and affection is necessary for there to be a deep personal relationship. If there is a significant period before the magic juice wears off and the affection fades, then there was a deep personal relationship during that time, but the deep personal relationship ended when the affection ended. Roger points to a massive contingency in who has affection for whom. Had Oberon sprinkled the magic juice differently, the affection would have been between Titania and Top instead of between Titania and Bottom. Again, if this affection lasted long enough, the deep personal relationship would have been between Titania and Top. Such contingency is unsettling, and yet we cannot plausibly deny that whom any one person ends up forming a relationship with is highly contingent, not just in fantasy, but in real life. Suppose that administering magic juice clarified Titania's and Bottom's vision so that now each sees clearly some of the other's qualities for the first time. Actually, a very similar thing can happen without magic. One person can know another well, but fail to perceive or appreciate some of his qualities until a chance remark or even a nonverbal revelation exposes these qualities so openly that strong affection for him ignites immediately. If the magic juice works by causing an epistemic improvement that ignites affection between Titania and Bottom, then once the strong affection between them has lasted for a considerable period, a deep personal relationship between Titania and Bottom exists. I submit. Now suppose that the magic juice somehow works without revealing to Titania or Bottom previously unknown qualities of the other. I think that even in this case, once the strong affection between them has lasted for a considerable period, Titania and Bottom have a deep personal relationship. Whether this deep personal relationship is valuable is something I'm going to come back to in a minute. However, some people have different reactions to, first of all, the case where Titania and Bottom have a multifaceted understanding of each other's personality, and then magic juice is needed to help them see each other's good qualities, and the case where magic juice works without revealing to Titania or Bottom previously unknown qualities of the other. The idea might be that the affection needed for a deep personal relationship cannot result from something as indiscriminate as the application of magic juice. Beyond question, if Titania and Bottom fall in love with one another because of magic juice, the cause of their love would not provide good reasons for the love. The same would be true if they fell in love with one another because of each other's beauty or ancestry or money or popularity or any number of other things. Think how often what initially attracts people to one another is something that does not actually warrant the affection they have for one another. Very often, although what initially attracts people to one another are qualities or connections that do not justify strong affection, the relationship nevertheless lasts. And some of these relationships achieve such an impressive degree of depth that we would have to classify them as deep relationships. Thus, there are cases in which people were initially attracted by qualities of each other that do not actually merit love, and yet, after a significant duration of multifaceted knowledge about one another and strong mutual affection, these people do share a deep personal relationship. Once we remember that the affection in what ends up being deep personal relationships in many actual cases sparked by qualities that do not warrant the affection, I cannot see why we would deny the conceptual possibility that in the fanciful case in which the affection is caused by magic juice, the relationship, I don't see how we would deny that the relationship could end up being a deep one. Whether the relationship two people have with one another is a deep one is one thing. Whether having a deep personal relationship is valuable enough to constitute an element of someone's well-being is another, I think, now that I've read Roger's paper. His examples show, I think, we need to distinguish between deep personal relationships that are valuable enough to constitute an element of well-being and deep personal relationships that are not valuable enough to constitute an element of well-being. I will argue that deep personal relationships that are valuable enough to constitute an element of well-being are ones between people who do have qualities that merit the other's affection, and deep personal relationships that are not valuable enough to constitute an element of well-being are ones between people who do not have such good qualities. I pose the thought experiment in which we compare two possible lives that really are equal in terms of quantities of pleasure, knowledge, achievement, and autonomy, but where one of these lives contains deep personal relationships and the other does not. And the conclusion of that thought experiment, I hoped at least most of you would draw, was that any possible life with deep personal relationships would have a higher level of being than any other life that's equal in terms of quantities of pleasure, knowledge, and achievement and autonomy, but devoid of deep personal relationships. And I hoped people would infer from that conclusion that having deep personal relationship constitutes an element of well-being. But Roger's example of Titania and Bottom mandates a qualification to that conclusion. Deep personal relationships constitute an element of well-being only if the relationships are between people who do have qualities that merit the other's affection. To consider a case in which people do not have the qualities that merit the other's affection, let us imagine that Titania finds herself with strong affection for Bottom, and nothing about Bottom warrants the strong affection for him. We might try imagining that the magic juice sparks her affection for Bottom without at all affecting her negative judgments about him. Suppose, for instance, that both before and after the magic juice is administered, she judges that he's selfish and cruel, with no admirable qualities. Nevertheless, she wakes up one morning to find herself with strong affection for him. If Titania feels strong affection for Bottom, but sincerely judges him to be completely awful, her attitudes towards him are incoherent and should strike her as so. Now, in some cases, there are people for whom one is morally required by one's relation to that person to have strong affection for that person, if possible. I'll come back to those cases. But let us suppose the case we are considering now is not such a case. Titania stands in no relation to Bottom that imposes on her a requirement to feel affection for him. Where one's affection for another is not required by a special relation to that person, one's affection for that person is under pressure not to exceed one's positive evaluations of that person. Let us imagine now, instead, that Titania makes no evaluative judgments about Bottom both before the magic juice was administered and after it was administered. In this case, after the magic juice has been administered, she finds herself for strong affection for Bottom, but she still makes no positive evaluations about him. Now, wouldn't Titania think her affection for Bottom mystifying? How could she make sense of her intense affection for him unless she thought he has at least some good qualities? I'm not proposing that she must be able to articulate what qualities of Bottom provide undefeated reasons for her strong affection for him, but I am proposing that having long-lasting affection for someone does not cohere with being unable to make at least some positive evaluative judgments about him. Another possibility, and this is the one really from a Midsummer Night's Dream, this is what happens in a Midsummer Night's Dream, is that the magic juice causes Titania not only to have strong affection for Bottom, but also to judge incorrectly that he has wonderful qualities. In this scenario, Titania is not guilty of incoherence between her attitudes towards Bottom and her judgments about him. They cohere. But she either has an empirically mistaken view of his character and personality, or is evaluating his character and personality in terms of the wrong criteria. Either way, she's badly mistaken to judge him favorably. Now I want to turn to the big point, which holds no matter whether Titania makes negative judgments about Bottom's bad qualities, no judgments about his bad qualities, or mistaken positive judgments about his bad qualities. If Titania has strong affection for Bottom over a sustained period of time, although he does not actually have qualities that merit the affection, then the scenario is terrible for Titania, whether or not she ever realizes it. To the extent that she devotes her affection, attention, and time to him, she wastes limited resources on an undeserving person. Admittedly, there might be some instrumental benefits to Titania of having a deep personal relationship with Bottom. However, we are interested here not in instrumental benefits, but in constitutive benefits. If she has a deep personal relationship with someone lacking qualities that merit her affection, this relationship does not constitute a benefit to Titania. On the contrary, this scenario must be a nightmare for anyone with Titania's well-being at heart. As Raz wrote, quote, "Love demeans the lover if bestowed on an unworthy object. Admiration is ridiculous if directed to the commonplace. Respect is perverted when those respected do not merit it." Actually, just let me ad lib briefly. In the play, when Oberon sees that Titania has fallen for Bottom, and Bottom, as you remember, has on him the head of an ass, so she's fallen for an ass, Oberon is so horrified and feels so sorry for her that he sprinkles more love juice, more magic juice on her eyes to reverse the previous thing. So I think Oberon was convinced by this. So let us, or at least Shakespeare was. So let us now turn from voluntary relationships to involuntary ones. There seems to be something morally wrong with people who do not have affection for their children, siblings, and parents, unless these children, siblings, or parents have behaved in such a hostile way that claims to affection were forfeited. Affection for someone can only be justified by the other's good qualities, can not only be justified by the other's good qualities, but also be morally required because of the special connection between these two people. For illustration, suppose two siblings have a deep personal relationship, even though one of them does not have good qualities, and both of them know this. A deep personal relationship can obtain in such a case without there being either incoherence or delusion about each other's qualities. Imagine that the bad sibling's affection for the good sibling is caused by recognition of the good sibling's good qualities, and the good sibling's affection for the bad sibling is caused by recognition of duty. In such a case, the deep personal relationship can be an element of the bad sibling's well-being, since this sibling's affection for the other does reflect the other's goodness. But the deep personal relationship would not be an element of the good sibling's well-being, because the other sibling doesn't have good qualities meriting the affection. Though, other things being equal, the good siblings having strong affection for the bad sibling makes the good sibling's life morally better than it would otherwise be. This paper has argued that having deep personal relationships is an element of your well-being if, but only if, the other people in these relationships have qualities that merit your affection. Having deep relationships with people who don't merit affection may bring you some instrumental benefits or may be morally admirable, but it does not constitute a benefit to you. I think I'll stop at that point since we got off to a bit of a late start. Thank you very, very much.